Orchids can be tricky plants to grow at home, can't they? They look gorgeous in the shop with their majestic blooms bewitching you, so you bring a couple home to proudly display in your home, but then a couple of weeks later the flowers fall off and they never come back, leaving you with just a pot of leaves and alien-like roots. In the bin they go, right? If this sounds familiar, then I completely get it, because this was me not long ago. So much so that I stopped buying them, thinking they were a waste of time. Well, I was missing out, and so are you too, because once you understand their growth habit, as well as their wants and don't wants, they will reward you with stunning flowers for months every single year for many years to come. I've now got a whole bunch of them in my collection. I do feel like I've got a pretty good idea on what I'm doing with them, so let me spill the beans. And this video is sponsored by Squarespace, and more on that in a bit. So to get this much misunderstood plant firing on all cylinders in our homes, we first need to understand their growth habit. Once we know this, everything clicks into place, trust me. We start to understand what light they need and why, what kind of watering is best, when we should repot them, and also the best way to prune them, all of which is coming up in this video. So these happy chappies are always displayed in the shop in their blooming phase. I mean, it makes sense, right? You wouldn't be in any way inclined to buy this, would you? And the trouble is, most people seem to buy these in the same way as they buy a bunch of cut flowers, to chuck them in the bin as soon as the flowers fade away, and this is a massive waste. The light these guys need during this blooming phase is massively important to prolong their life, as I'll explain in a bit. Now, once the plant has done flowering, it goes into the growth phase. This phase is all about rest and recuperation and getting ready for the next blooming cycle. This stage is massively important, and if we get it wrong here, we won't get a strong flowering cycle, if one at all. So leaf growth and root development will be the main focus, so we need to help him do just that. This phase is the longest phase and normally lasts 5 months or so. Once he feels like he's recharged his batteries enough, he'll start the flower spike development phase, and this normally lasts a couple of months. After that, bud formation on the flower spike will start, and it'll take him about a month to show off his blooms. We're then back in the flowering phase, and this should last a good 4 months, all being well. And there are some nifty tricks we can do to prolong this as much as possible, and it involves getting your snippers out. Pruning your orchid when in the flowering phase. A much misunderstood practice, but hopefully now that we know all about the life cycle, it will all make sense. It did for me anyway. A few weeks after you've brought your orchid home, the flowers will start to fade and eventually fall off. And this is par for the course, so there's no need to panic. Sometimes this happens quite quickly, and sometimes the flowers seem to last forever. The truth is, this actually depends on if you bought an orchid that has all its blooms already on show, or whether there are some unopened blooms still on the spike that will open later in your home. And the trick is to buy the latter. Once you're left with something like this, you have 3 options. Providing the spike is green and healthy, we can leave it intact and hope that the spike will produce more flowers from low down. I found this to be fairly unlikely, and despite all the hoping and praying, they do seem to need human intervention to produce more flowers. Plus, leaving the spike intact like this means it will take longer for him to recover for his next blooming stage next year. Option 2 is to cut the spike above the highest unopened node. This encourages branching, and a fresh set of flowers will follow. I have found that this doesn't always work though, particularly if you've not got the watering and light correct. More on that in a bit. Now this is the option I take, but I only prune once, and here's why. Repeatedly pruning and waiting for the plant to send out yet more flowers delays the rest period, and I found that subsequent growth and the next flowering cycle to be weaker. The more you cut, the less impressive the next batch of flowers tends to be, and this tends to eat into the rest period the plant needs to send out an impressive brand new set of flowers next year. This leads me to option 3, to cut the spike off completely. Firstly, if the spike is brown and has dried out, then absolutely cut it off as close to the base as possible. It's donezo. If the spike is still green and healthy, then cutting it off completely rather than just at the node could be the way to go. The plant can fully rest and recover, and future bloom should be much more robust. Like I say though, I like to prune once to get more juice from the plant, and then after that, I cut the spikes down. Now, the light you give your little guy during this flowering phase is massively important. To unpack that though, we first need to talk about light for the all-important growth phase. You know, the phase without any flowers where the plant just wants to grow leaves and roots. Here, the plant just wants to lap up as much light as possible. Photosynthesis is king, and Mr. Orchid just wants to sit on his throne and bask in the good stuff all day. And if you get it right, you should start to see the little fella grow new leaves from the middle. Getting it right involves placing him near a bright window. In my climate, here in gloomy Sheffield, I sit them right up against my south-facing window and they love it. If you're in a hotter climate than me, then you might need to set him back further to avoid scorching on the leaves, but do have a play and see what's best. If you've only got a north-facing window and you're in the northern hemisphere, then this probably won't cut it. A Santi grow light will be your best friend then, details of which are linked in the description, along with a code for an exclusive 25% discount. Stick it on for at least 12 hours a day. So the plant will hopefully soak up lots of sun, recharge his batteries, produce lots of new leaves, and then, when he's ready, he'll send out a flower spike or two. Now, up until the first flowers show themselves, you want the light to be the same, nice and consistent. Any moving around and this will only upset him, and he might punish you with weaker blooms. But once they're out and on full show, we need to reduce the light. This is the trick. I'll go over why, but first, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build your online presence. Whether you're creating a blog, launching a business, or showcasing your portfolio, Squarespace makes it ridiculously easy. Choose some stunning templates that look amazing right out of the box, so no design skills required. Plus, with drag and drop tools, you can customize every detail to reflect your style. Selling products? Squarespace has built-in e-commerce features to help you manage inventory, track orders, and even handle taxes. Want to grow your audience? Use their powerful analytics and marketing tools to drive traffic and connect with your community. Head to squarespace.com to start your free trial today, and when you're ready to launch, use code Sheffield for 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. So, less light when flowering. Sounds weird, I know, but the aim of the game here is to prolong blooms, and as anyone in the flowering business knows, to prolong blooms, we should give less light. Bright light encourages a faster metabolism for Mr. Orchid, and the flowers will fade quicker. So set him further back from the window, or if he's under a grow light, move him further away or reduce the number of hours the light is on. But don't stick him in a dark cupboard or anything daft, just a little less light. So that's the light sorted. Equally important is watering, especially during the growth phase. Watering orchids really did flummox me for the longest time because it's completely different to how we water our houseplants, and that's mainly because of the soil mix that they get to call home. And when I say soil, I don't mean soil at all. They're normally living in bark or moss, no soil to be seen. This is of course because they're epiphytes, plants that generally grow in the bark of trees rather than in soil in the ground. So bark doesn't hold on to moisture nearly as long as soil, which means we're in danger of killing the roots from dehydration if we're not careful. Now when the orchid is in the growth phase, he'll be thirsty for water. His metabolism will be in overdrive from all the light you're giving him and all those leaves he's producing. This means we need to give him a good drink when his roots and bark start to dry out, but judging this can be tricky though, and it's where clear plastic pots come in super handy. If there is lots of condensation in the pot, then leave it another couple of days and check again. The pot should be dry. You can stick your finger in and have a bit of a rummage too. If it feels dry in there, then give him a drink. But don't stress too much about if it's dry or not. You won't kill him by giving him a good drink a couple of days before he's absolutely ready. Death only really happens if he's soaking wet for weeks or months at a time, or if he's been told to live in soil. Another pro tip to see how hydrated an orchid is to check the roots. Green roots are well hydrated, brown, black and mushy roots are overwatered, and silvery roots are when it's time to water. That's the general guide. If the roots of your orchid are consistently green and silvery and nice and plump, then you're watering like a Proma plant friend. So what's the best way to water these devilishly tricky plants? Well, option 1 is to take your orchid over to the sink and pour a bunch of water all over the bark and roots. During the growth phase, I would normally do this once a week, but it does depend on your climate. It's always best to check first. Now there are lots of warnings out there that say to avoid wetting the leaves, and especially the crown of the plant at all costs, and honestly this is a little overblown in my book. Sure, it's best to avoid this if you can, but if you do get a splash of water on the leaves, then no biggie, just dry them off with some kitchen roll. Simples. Any moisture left over will soon dry off when sat next to your bright window. The main sign that this is becoming an issue for you is multiple yellowing leaves. The odd yellowing leaf that is clearly the oldest is not normally an issue though, and rather just a sign of aging. So this watering over the sink malarkey was the method I used for a long time, until I realised that I wasn't hydrating the roots or the bark as much as he'd like. and you can normally tell this when the leaves aren't as plump as they should be. So I've since switched it up to the soak and drain method, and my orchids are much better for it. I pour a bunch of water into the cash pot and let the orchid bathe in it for a good half an hour or so. Making sure your orchid is properly hydrated during the growth phase is so important, and letting the poor fella dry out for too long in between will lead to weaker blooms or worse, no blooms at all. When your little guy is in full flowering mode, he will be a little more forgiving, but I still make sure to keep him hydrated. Forget about him for a month and those blooms will soon drop off. After a year of growing leaves and roots and then flowering, you might start to notice that your little guy is not so little anymore. He's grown quite a healthy pack down there, and he might need upgrading from a 2-bed terrace to a 3-bed semi. It's best to have a look at this after he's done flowering and after you've cut off his spikes. A good sign he has outgrown his home is that the pot is majority roots and he's pushing himself out of the pot. Get a clear plastic pot that is a couple of sizes bigger and it'll be a much happier specimen for the upcoming growth phase. I do advise going clear plastic pots because orchid roots are capable of photosynthesizing, so it's a good thing to let them bask in some light. And this is when you start to see green tips on the end of the roots like this. And repotting is a great opportunity to give the roots a bit of a service, and this means pruning, my plant friend. Yeah, orchid roots can be pruned, and if things are black and mushy, it's definitely the way to go. We don't want dead roots rotting and creating a mess in the pot after all. The name of the game with orchid roots is airflow. This means 2 things. Never use soil and don't pack everything in too tightly. I personally always use bark because I find moss to be a pain in the bum when it comes to repotting. So I mentioned earlier about pruning the flower spikes to encourage more blooming, but there is actually a trick you can do that will make for a stronger set of flowers, and it's all about where you cut on the spike. I spill all the beans in this video here, so make sure you click it to watch it next, and I'll see you there.